Chapter 18 of Lives of the Engineers, George and Robert Stephenson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Andy Minter. Lives of the Engineers, George and Robert Stephenson, by Samuel Smiles. Chapter 18. George Stephenson's Closing Years, Illness and Death. In describing the completion of the series of great works detailed in the preceding chapter, we have somewhat anticipated the closing years of George Stephenson's life. He could not fail to take an anxious interest in the success of his son's designs, and he accordingly paid many visits to Conway and to Menai during the progress of the works. He was present on the occasion of the floating and racing of the first Conway tube, and there witnessed a clear proof of the soundness of Robert's judgment as to the efficiency and strength of the tubular bridge, of which he had at first expressed some doubts. But before the like test could be applied at the Britannia Bridge, George Stephenson's mortal anxieties were at an end, for he had then ceased from all his labours. Towards the close of his life, George Stephenson almost entirely withdrew from the active pursuit of his profession. He devoted himself chiefly to his extensive collieries and lime works, taking a local interest only in such projected railways as were calculated to open up new markets for their products. At home he lived the life of a country gentleman, enjoying his garden and grounds, and indulging his love of nature, which, through all his busy life, had never left him. It was not until the year 1845 that he took an active interest in horticultural pursuits. Then he began to build new melon houses, pineries and vineries of great extent, and he now seemed as eager to excel all other growers of exotic plants in his neighbourhood as he had been to surpass the villagers of Killingworth in the production of gigantic cabbages and cauliflowers some 30 years before. He had a pine house built 68 feet in length and a pinery 140 feet. Workmen were constantly employed in enlarging them, until at length he had no fewer than 10 glass forcing houses heated with hot water, which he was one of the first in that neighbourhood to make use of for such a purpose. He did not take so much pleasure in flowers as in fruits. At one of the county agricultural meetings, he said that he intended yet to grow pineapples at Tapton as big as pumpkins. The only man to whom he would knock under was his friend Paxton, the gardener to the Duke of Devonshire, and he was so old in the service and so skilful that he could scarcely hope to beat him. Yet his Queen pines did take the first prize at a competition with the Duke, though this was not until shortly after his death, when the plants had become more fully grown. His grapes also took the first prize at Rotherham, at a competition open to all England. He was extremely successful in producing melons, having invented a method of suspending them in baskets of wire gauze, which, by relieving the stalk from tension, allowed nutrition to proceed more freely, and better enabled the fruit to grow and ripen. He took much pride also in his growth of cucumbers. He raised them very fine and large, but he could not make them grow straight. Place them as he would, notwithstanding all his propping of them and humouring them by modifying the application of heat and the admission of light for the purpose of effecting his object, they would still insist on growing crooked in their own way. At last he had a number of glass cylinders made at Newcastle for the purpose of an experiment. Into these the growing cucumbers were inserted, and then he succeeded in growing them perfectly straight. Carrying one of the new products into his house one day, and exhibiting it to a party of visitors, he told them of the expedient he had adopted, and added gleefully, "I think I've bothered them now." Mr. Stephenson also carried on farming operations with some success. He experimented on manure, and fed cattle after methods of his own. He was very particular as to breed and build in stock breeding. "You see, sir," he said to one gentleman, "I like to see the cow's back at a gradient, something like this," drawing an imaginary line with his hand, "and then the ribs or girders will carry more flesh than if they were so or so." When he attended the county agricultural meetings, which he frequently did, he was accustomed to take part in the discussions, and he brought the same vigorous practical mind to bear on the questions of tillage, drainage, and farm economy, which he had been accustomed to exercise on mechanical and engineering matters. All his early affection for birds and animals revived. He had favourite dogs and cows and horses, and again he began to keep rabbits, and to pride himself on the beauty of his breed. There was not a bird's nest upon the grounds that he did not know of, and from day to day he went round watching the progress which the birds made with their building, carefully guarding them from injury. No one was more minutely acquainted with the habits of British birds, the result of a long, loving, and close observation of nature. At Tapton he remembered the failure of his early experiment in hatching birds' eggs by heat, and he now performed it successfully, being able to secure a proper apparatus for maintaining a uniform temperature. He was also curious about the breeding and fattening of fowls, and when his friend Edward Pease of Darlington visited him at Tapton, he explained a method which he had invented for fattening chickens in half the usual time. Mrs. Stephenson tried to keep bees, but found they would not thrive at Tapton. Many hives perished, and there was no case of success. The cause of failure was a puzzle to the engineer, but one day his acute powers of observation enabled him to unravel it. At the foot of the hill on which Tapton House stands, he saw some bees trying to rise up from amongst the grass, laden with honey and wax. They were already exhausted, as if with long flying, and then it occurred to him that the height at which the house stood above the bees' feeding ground rendered it difficult for them to reach their hives when heavy laden, and hence they sank exhausted. He afterwards incidentally mentioned the circumstance to Mr. Jesse, the naturalist, who concurred in his view as to the cause of failure, and was much struck by the keen observation which had led to its solution. Mr. Stephenson had none of the indoor habits of the student. He read very little, for reading is a habit which is generally acquired in youth, and his youth and manhood had been for the most part spent in hard work. Books wearied him and sent him to sleep. Novels excited his feelings too much, and he avoided them, though he would occasionally read through a philosophical book on a subject in which he felt particularly interested. He wrote very few letters with his own hand. Nearly all his letters were dictated, and he avoided even dictation when he could. His greatest pleasure was in conversation, from which he gathered most of his imparted information. It was his practice, when about to set out on a journey by railway, to walk along the train before it started, and to look into the carriages to see if he could find a conversable face. On one of these occasions, at the Euston station, he discovered in a carriage a very handsome, manly, and intelligent face, which he afterwards found was that of the late Lord Denman. He was on his way down to his seat at Stony Middleton in Derbyshire. Mr. Stephenson entered the carriage, and the two were shortly engaged in interesting conversation. It turned upon chronometry and horology, and the engineer amazed his lordship by the extent of his knowledge on the subject, in which he displayed as much minute information, even down to the latest improvements in watchmaking, as if he had been bred a watchmaker and lived by the trade. Lord Denman was curious to know how a man whose time must have been mainly engrossed by engineering had gathered so much knowledge on a subject quite out of his own line, and he asked the question. "I learnt clockmaking and watchmaking," was the answer, "while a working man at Killingworth, when I made a little money in my spare hours by cleaning the pitmen's clocks and watches, and since then I have kept up my information on the subject." This led to further questions, and then Mr. Stephenson told Lord Denman the interesting story of his life, which held him entranced during the remainder of the journey. Many of his friends readily accepted invitations to Tapton House to enjoy his hospitality, which never failed. With them he would fight his battles o'er again, reverting to his battle for the locomotive, and he was never tired of telling, nor were his auditors of listening to, the lively anecdotes with which he was accustomed to illustrate the struggles of his early career. While walking in the woods or through the grounds, he would arrest his friend's attention by allusion to some simple object, such as a leaf, a blade of grass, a bit of bark, a nest of birds, or an ant carrying its eggs across the path, and descant in glowing terms upon the creative power of the divine mechanician, whose contrivances were so exhaustless and so wonderful. This was a theme upon which he was often accustomed to dwell in reverential admiration, when in the society of his more intimate friends. One night, when walking under the stars and gazing up into the field of suns, each the probable centre of a system forming the Milky Way, a friend said to him, "What an insignificant creature is man in sight of so immense a creation as that!" "Yes," was his reply, "but how wonderful a creature also is man, to be able to think and reason, and even in some measure to comprehend works so infinite." A microscope, which he had brought down to Tapton, was a source of immense enjoyment to him, and he was never tired of contemplating the minute wonders which it revealed. One evening, when some friends were visiting him, he induced them each to puncture their skin, so as to draw blood, in order that he might examine the globules through the microscope. One of the gentlemen present was a teetotaler, and Mr. Stephenson pronounced his blood to be the most lively of the whole. He had a theory of his own about the movement of the globules in the blood, which has since become familiar. It was that they were respectively charged with electricity, positive at one end and negative at the other, and that thus they attracted and repelled each other, causing a circulation. No sooner did he observe anything new than he immediately set about devising a reason for it. His training in mechanics, his practical familiarity with matter in all its forms, and the strong bent of his mind, led him first of all to seek for a mechanical explanation. And yet he was ready to admit that there was something in the principle of life so mysterious and inexplicable, which baffled mechanics and seemed to dominate over and control them. He did not care much either for abstruse mechanics, but only for experimental and practical, as is usually the case with those whose knowledge has been self-acquired. Even at his advanced age, the spirit of frolic had not left him. When proceeding from Chesterfield Station to Tapton House with his friends, he would almost invariably challenge them to a race up the steep path, partly formed of stone steps, along the hillside, and he would struggle, as of old, to keep the front place, though by this time his wind greatly failed. He would occasionally invite an old friend to take a quiet wrestle with him on the lawn, to keep up his skill, and perhaps to try some new knack of throwing. In the evening he would sometimes indulge his visitors by reciting the old pastoral of Damon and Phyllis, or singing his favourite song of John Anderson, my Joe. But his greatest glory among those with whom he was most intimate was a crowdy. "Let's have a crowdy night," he would say, and forthwith a kettle of boiling water was ordered in with a basin of oatmeal. Taking a large bowl containing a sufficiency of hot water and placing it between his knees, he poured in oatmeal with one hand and stirred the mixture vigorously with the other. When enough meal had been added and the stirring was completed, the crowdy was made. It was then supped with new milk, and Stephenson generally pronounced it capital. It was the diet to which he had been accustomed when a working man, and all the dainties with which he had become familiar in recent years had not spoilt his simple tastes. To enjoy crowdy at his age, besides, indicated that he still possessed that quality on which no doubt much of his practical success in life had depended, a strong and healthy digestion. He would also frequently invite to his house the humbler companions of his early life, and take pleasure in talking over old times with them. He never assumed any of the bearings of a great man on such occasions, but treated the visitors with the same friendliness and respect as if they had been his equals, sending them away, pleased with themselves and delighted with him. At other times, needy men who had known him in youth would knock at his door, and they were never refused access. But if he heard of any misconduct on their part, he would rate them soundly. One who knew him intimately in private life had seen him exhorting such backsliders and denouncing their misconduct and imprudence with the tears streaming down his cheeks, and he would generally conclude by opening his purse and giving them the help which they needed to make a fresh start in the world. Mr. Stephenson's life at Tapton during his latter years was occasionally diversified with a visit to London. His engineering business having become limited, he generally went there for the purpose of visiting friends or to see what there was fresh going on. He found a new race of engineers springing up on all hands, men who knew him not, and his London journeys gradually ceased to yield him pleasure. A friend used to take him to the opera, but by the end of the first act he was generally in a profound slumber. Yet on one occasion he enjoyed a visit to the Haymarket with a party of friends on his birthday to see T.P. Cook in Black-Eyed Susan, if that can be called enjoyment which kept him in a state of tears throughout half the performance. At other times he visited Newcastle, which always gave him great pleasure. He would, on such occasions, go out to Killingworth and seek up old friends, and if the people whom he knew were too retiring and shrunk into their cottages, he went and sought them there. Striking the floor with his stick and holding his noble person upright, he would say, in his own kind way, "Well, and how's all here to-day?" To the last he had always a warm heart for Newcastle and its neighbourhood. Sir Robert Peel on more than one occasion invited George Stephenson to his mansion at Drayton, where he was accustomed to assemble round him men of the highest distinction in art, science, and legislation during the intervals of his parliamentary life. The first invitation was respectfully declined. Sir Robert invited him a second time, and a second time he declined. "I have no great ambition," he said, "to mix in fine company, and perhaps should feel out of my element among such high folks." But Sir Robert a third time pressed him to come down to Tamworth early in January 1845, when he would meet Buckland, Follett, and others well known to both. "Well, Sir Robert," said he, "I feel your kindness very much, and can no longer refuse. I will come down and join your party." Mr. Stephenson's strong powers of observation, together with his native humour and shrewdness, imparted to his conversation at all times much vigour and originality, and made him, to young and old, a delightful companion. Though mainly an engineer, he was also a profound thinker on many scientific questions, and there was scarcely a subject of speculation or a department of recondite science on which he had not employed his faculties in such a way as to have formed large and original views. At Drayton the conversation usually turned upon such topics, and Mr. Stephenson freely joined in it. On one occasion an animated discussion took place between himself and Dr. Buckland on one of his favourite theories as to the formation of coal, but the result was that Dr. Buckland, a much greater master of tongue fence than Mr. Stephenson, completely silenced him. Next morning, before breakfast, when he was walking in the grounds, deeply pondering, Sir William Follett came up and asked what he was thinking about. "Why, Sir William, I'm thinking over that argument I had with Buckland last night. I know I'm right, and that if I only had the command of words which he has, I'd have beaten him." "Let me know all about it," said Sir William, "and I'll see what I can do for you." The two sat down in an arbour, and the astute lawyer made himself thoroughly acquainted with the points of the case, entering into it with all the zeal of an advocate about to plead the dearest interests of his client. After he had mastered the subject, Sir William rose up, rubbing his hands with glee, and said, "Now I'm ready for him." Sir Robert Peel was made acquainted with the plot, and adroitly introduced the subject of the controversy after dinner. The result was that in the argument which followed, the man of science was overcome by the man of law, and Sir William Follett had at all points the mastery over Dr. Buckland. "What do you say, Mr. Stephenson?" asked Sir Robert, laughing. "Why," said he, "I will say only this, that of all the powers above and under the earth, there seems to me no power so great as the gift of the gab." One Sunday, when the party had just returned from church, they were standing together on the terrace near the hall, and observed in the distance a railway train flashing along, tossing behind it a long white plume of steam. "Now, Buckland," said Stephenson, "I have a poser for you. Can you tell me what is the power that is driving that train?" "Well," said the other, "I suppose it is one of your big engines." "But what drives the engine?" "Oh, very likely a canny Newcastle driver." "What do you say to the light of the sun?" "How can that be?" asked the doctor. "It is nothing else," said the engineer. "It is light, bottled up in the earth for tens of thousands of years. Light, absorbed by plants and vegetables, being necessary for the condensation of carbon during the process of their growth, if it be not carbon in another form. And now, after being buried in the earth for long ages in fields of coal, that latent light is again brought forth and liberated, made to work as in that locomotive for great human purposes." During the same visit, Mr. Stephenson one evening repeated his experiment with blood drawn from the finger, submitting it to the microscope, in order to show the curious circulation of the globules. He set the example by pricking his own thumb, and the other guests, by turn, in like manner, gave up a small portion of their blood for the purpose of ascertaining the comparative liveliness of their circulation. When Sir Robert Peel's turn came, Mr. Stephenson said he was curious to know how the blood globules of a great politician would conduct themselves. Sir Robert held forth his finger for the purpose of being pricked, but once and again he sensitively shrunk back, and at length the experiment, as far as he was concerned, was abandoned. Sir Robert Peel's sensitiveness to pain was extreme, and yet he was destined, a few years after, to die a death of the most distressing agony. In 1847, the year before his death, Mr. Stephenson was again invited to join a distinguished party at Drayton Manor, and to assist in the ceremony of formally opening the Trent Valley Railway, which had been originally designed and laid out by himself many years before. The first sod of the railway had been cut by the Prime Minister in November 1845, during the time when Mr. Stephenson was abroad on the business of the Spanish Railway. The formal opening took place on the 26th of June 1847, the line having been thus constructed in less than 2 years. What a change had come over the spirit of the landed gentry since the time when George Stephenson had first projected a railway through that district. Then they were up in arms against him, characterising him as the devastator and spoiler of their estates. Now he was hailed as one of the greatest benefactors of the age. Sir Robert Peel, the chief political personage in England, welcomed him as a guest and a friend, and spoke of him as the chief among practical philosophers. A dozen members of Parliament, 7 baronets, with all the landed magnates of the district, assembled to celebrate the opening of the railway. The clergy were there to bless the enterprise, and to bid all hail to railway progress as enabling them to carry on with greater facility those operations in connection with religion which were calculated to be so beneficial to the country. The army, speaking through the mouth of General Lacourt, acknowledged the vast importance of railways as tending to improve the military defences of the country, and representatives from 8 corporations were there to acknowledge the great benefits which railways had conferred upon the merchants, tradesmen, and working classes of their respective towns and cities. In the spring of 1848, Mr. Stephenson was invited to Whittington House, near Chesterfield, the residence of his friend and former pupil, Mr. Swanwick, to meet the distinguished American, Emerson. Upon being introduced, they did not immediately engage in conversation, but presently Stephenson jumped up, took Emerson by the collar, and giving him one of his friendly shakes, asked how it was that in England we could always tell an American. This led to an interesting conversation, in the course of which Emerson said how much he had been everywhere struck by the haleness and comeliness of the English men and women. And then they diverged into a further discussion of the influences which air, climate, moisture, soil, and other conditions exercised upon the physical and moral development of a people. The conversation was next directed to the subject of electricity, upon which Stephenson launched out enthusiastically, explaining his views by several simple and striking illustrations. From thence it gradually turned to the events of his own life, which he related in so graphic a manner as completely to rivet the attention of the American. Afterwards Emerson said that it was worth crossing the Atlantic to have seen Stephenson alone. He had such native force of character and vigour of intellect. The rest of Mr. Stephenson's days were spent quietly at Tapton, amongst his dogs, his rabbits, and his birds. When not engaged about the works connected with his collieries, he was occupied in horticulture and farming. He continued proud of his flowers, his fruits, and his crops, and the old spirit of competition was still strong within him. Although he had for some time been in delicate health, and his hand shook from nervous affection, he appeared to possess a sound constitution. Emerson had observed of him that he had the lives of many men in him. But perhaps the American spoke figuratively, in reference to his vast stores of experience. It appeared that he had never completely recovered from the attack of pleurisy which seized him during his return from Spain. As late, however, as the 26th of July, 1848, he felt himself sufficiently well to be able to attend a meeting of the Institute of Mechanical Engineers at Birmingham, and to read to the members his paper on the fallacies of the rotatory engine. It was his last appearance before them. Shortly after his return to Tapton, he had an attack of intermittent fever, from which he seemed to be recovering, when a sudden effusion of blood from the lungs carried him off on the 12th of August, 1848, in the 67th year of his age. When all was over,
Robert wrote to Edward Pease, "With deep pain I inform you, as one of his oldest friends, of the death of my dear father this morning at 12 o'clock, after about 10 days' illness from severe fever." Mr. Starbuck, who was also present, wrote, "The favourable symptoms of yesterday morning were towards evening followed by a serious change for the worse. This continued during the night, and early this morning it became evident that he was sinking. At a few minutes before 12 to-day he breathed his last. All that the most devoted and unremitting care of Mrs. Stephenson and the skill of medicine could accomplish has been done, but in vain." George Stephenson's remains were followed to the grave by a large body of his workpeople, by whom he was greatly admired and beloved. They remembered him as a kind master, who was ever ready actively to promote all measures for their moral, physical, and mental improvement. The inhabitants of Chesterfield evinced their respect for the deceased by suspending business, closing their shops, and joining in the funeral procession, which was headed by the corporation of the town. Many of the surrounding gentry also attended. The body was interred in Trinity Church, Chesterfield, where a simple tablet marks the great engineer's last resting place. The statue of George Stephenson, which the Liverpool and Manchester and Grand Junction companies had commissioned, was on its way to England when his death occurred, and it served for a monument, though his best monument will always be his works. The statue referred to was placed in St. George's Hall, Liverpool. A full-length statue of him by Bailey was also erected a few years later in the noble vestibule of the London and North Western Station in Euston Square. A subscription for the purpose was set on foot by the Society of Mechanical Engineers, of which he had been founder and president. A few advertisements were inserted in the newspapers inviting subscriptions, and it is a notable fact that the voluntary offerings included an average of 2 shillings each from 3,150 working men, who embraced this opportunity of doing honour to their distinguished fellow workmen. But unquestionably, the finest and most appropriate statue to the memory of George Stephenson is that erected in 1862, after the design of John Luff, at Newcastle upon Tyne. It is in the immediate neighbourhood of the Literary and Philosophical Institute, to which both George and his son Robert were so much indebted in their early years, close to the great Stephenson locomotive factory established by the shrewdness of the father, and in the vicinity of the high-level bridge, one of the grandest products of the genius of the son. The head of Stephenson, as expressed in this noble work, is massive, characteristic, and faithful, and the attitude of the figure is simple, yet manly and energetic. It stands on a pedestal, at the respective corners of which are sculptured the recumbent figures of a pitman, a mechanic, an engine driver, and a plate layer. The statue appropriately stands in a very thoroughfare of working men, thousands of whom see it daily as they pass to and from their work, and we can imagine them, as they look up to Stephenson's manly figure, applying to it the words addressed by Robert Nicoll to Robert Burns, with perhaps still greater appropriateness. "Before the proudest of the earth we stand with an uplifted brow. Like us thou wast a toiling man, and we are noble now." The portrait prefixed to this volume gives a good indication of George Stephenson's shrewd, kind, honest, manly face. His fair, clear countenance was ruddy, and seemingly glowed with health. The forehead was large and high, projecting over the eyes, and there was that massive breadth across the lower part which is usually observed in men of eminent constructive skill. The mouth was firmly marked, and shrewdness and humour lurked there as well as in the keen grey eye. His frame was compact, well knit, and rather spare. His hair became grey at an early age, and towards the close of his life it was of a pure silky whiteness. He dressed neatly in black, wearing a white neckcloth, and his face, his person, and his deportment at once arrested attention and marked the gentleman. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of Lives of the Engineers, George and Robert Stephenson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Andy Minter. Lives of the Engineers, George and Robert Stephenson, by Samuel Smiles. Chapter 19. Robert Stephenson's Victoria Bridge, Lower Canada,
Illness and death. Stephenson characteristics. George Stephenson bequeathed to his son his valuable collieries, his share in the engine manufactory at Newcastle, and his large accumulation of savings, which, together with the fortune he had himself amassed by railway work, gave Robert the position of an engineer millionaire, the first of his order. He continued, however, to live in a quiet style, and although he bought occasional pictures and statues, and indulged in the luxury of a yacht, he did not live up to his income, which went on rapidly accumulating until his death. There was no longer the necessity for applying himself to the laborious business of a parliamentary engineer, in which he had now been occupied for some 15 years. Shortly after his father's death, Edward Pease strongly recommended him to give up the more harassing work of his profession, and his reply, 15th of June, 1850, was as follows: "The suggestion which your kind note contains is quite in accordance with my own feelings and intentions respecting retirement, but I find it a very difficult matter to bring to a close so complicated a connection in business as that which has been established by 25 years of active and arduous professional duty. Comparative retirement is, however, my intention, and I trust that your prayer for the divine blessing to grant me happiness and quiet comfort will be fulfilled. I cannot but feel deeply grateful to the great disposer of events for the success which has hitherto attended my exertions in life, and I trust that the future will also be marked by a continuance of his mercies." Although Robert Stephenson, in conformity with this expressed intention, for the most part declined to undertake new business, he did not altogether lay aside his harness, and he lived to repeat his tubular bridges both in Lower Canada and in Egypt. The success of the tubular system, as adopted at Menai and Conway, was such as to recommend it for adoption wherever great span was required, and the peculiar circumstances connected with the navigation of the St. Lawrence and the Nile may be said to have compelled its adoption in carrying railways across those great rivers. The Victoria Bridge, of which Robert Stephenson was the designer and chief engineer, is without exception the greatest work of the kind in the world. For gigantic proportions and vast length and strength, there is nothing to compare with it in ancient or modern times. The entire bridge, with its approaches, is only about 60 yards short of 2 miles, being 5 times longer than the Britannia across the Menai Straits, 7.5 times longer than Waterloo Bridge, and more than 10 times longer than the New Chelsea Bridge across the Thames. It has not less than 24 spans of 242 feet each, and one great central span, itself an immense bridge, of 330 feet. The road is carried within iron tubes 60 feet above the level of the St. Lawrence, which runs beneath at a speed of about 10 miles an hour, and in winter brings down the ice of 2,000 square miles of lakes and rivers, with their numerous tributaries. The weight of iron in the tubes is about 10,000 tons, supported on massive piers, which contain some 6 and others 10,000 tons of solid masonry. So gigantic a work, involving so heavy an expenditure, about £1,300,000, was not projected without sufficient cause. The Grand Trunk Railway of Canada, upwards of 1,200 miles in length, traverses British North America from the shores of the Atlantic to the rich prairie country of the far west. It opens up a vast extent of fertile territory for future immigration, and provides a ready means for transporting the varied products of the western states to the seaboard. So long as the St. Lawrence was relied on, the inhabitants along the Great Valley were precluded from communication with each other for nearly 6 months of the year, during which the navigation was closed by the ice. The Grand Trunk Railway was designed to furnish a line of communication through this great district at all seasons, following the course of the St. Lawrence along its north bank, and uniting the principal towns of Canada. But stopping short on the north shore, it was still an incomplete work, unconnected, except by a dangerous and often impracticable ferry, with Montreal, the capital of the province, and shut off from connection with the United States, as well as with the coast, to which the commerce of Canada naturally tends. Without a bridge at Montreal, therefore, it was felt that the system of Canadian railway communication would have been incomplete, and the benefits of the Grand Trunk Railway in a great measure nugatory. As early as 1846, the construction of a bridge across the St. Lawrence at Montreal was strongly advocated by the local press for the purpose of directly connecting that city with the then projected Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railway. A survey of the bridge was made, and the scheme was reported to be practicable. A period of colonial depression, however, intervened, and although the project was not lost sight of, it was not until 1852, when the Grand Trunk Railway Company began their operations, that there seemed to be any reasonable prospect of its being carried out. In that year, Mr. A.M. Ross, who had superintended under Robert Stephenson the construction of the tubular bridge over the Conway, visited Canada and inspected the site of the proposed bridge, when he readily arrived at the conclusion that a like structure was suitable for the crossing of the St. Lawrence. He returned to England to confer with Robert Stephenson on the subject, and the result was the plan of the Victoria Bridge, of which Robert Stephenson was the designer and Mr. A.M. Ross the joint and resident engineer. The particular kind of structure to be adopted, however, formed the subject of much preliminary discussion. Even after the design of a tubular bridge had been adopted and the piers were commenced, the plan was made the subject of severe criticism on the grounds of its alleged excessive cost. It therefore became necessary for Mr. Stephenson to vindicate the propriety of his design in a report to the directors of the railway, in which he satisfactorily proved that as respected strength, efficiency and economy, with a view to permanency, the plan of the Victoria Bridge was unimpeachable. There were various methods proposed for spanning the St. Lawrence. The suspension bridge, such as that over the river Niagara, was found inapplicable for several reasons, but chiefly because of its defective rigidity, which greatly limited the speed and weight of the trains, and consequently the amount of traffic which could be passed over such a bridge. Thus, taking the length of the Victoria Bridge into account, it was found that not more than 20 trains could pass within the 24 hours, a number insufficient for the accommodation of the anticipated traffic. To introduce such an amount of material into the suspension bridge as would supply increased rigidity would only be approximating to the original beam and neutralising any advantages in point of cheapness which might be derivable from this form of structure, without securing the essential stiffness and strength. Iron arches were also considered inapplicable, because of the large headway required for the passage of the ice in winter, and the necessity which existed for keeping the springing of the arches clear of the waterline. This would have involved the raising of the entire road, and a largely increased expenditure on the upper works. The question was therefore reduced to the consideration of the kind of horizontal beam or girder to be employed. Horizontal girders are of three kinds. The tubular is constructed of riveted rectangular boiler plates. Where the span is large, the road passes within the tube. Where the span is comparatively small, the roadway is supported by two or more rectangular beams. Next, there is the lattice girder, borrowed from the loose, rough timber bridges of the American engineers, consisting of a top and bottom flange, connected by a number of flat iron bars, riveted across each other at a certain angle, the roadway resting on the top or being suspended at the bottom between the lattice on either side. Bridges on the same construction are now extensively used for crossing the broad rivers of India, and are especially designed with a view to their easy transport and erection. The trellis or warren girder is a modification of the same plan, consisting of a top and bottom flange with a connecting web of diagonal flat bars, forming a complete system of triangulation, hence the name of triangular girder, by which it is generally known. The merit of this form consists in its comparative rigidity, strength, lightness, and economy of material. These bridges are also extensively employed in spanning the rivers of India. One of the best specimens is the Crumlin Viaduct, 200 feet high at one point, which spans the river and valley of the Ebba, near the village of Crumlin in South Wales. This viaduct is about a third of a mile long, divided into two parts by a ridge of hills which runs through the centre of the valley, each part forming a separate viaduct, the one of 7 equal spans of 150 feet, and the other of 3 spans of the same diameter. The bridge has been very skilfully designed and constructed, and by reason of its great dimensions and novel arrangements, is entitled to be regarded as one of the most remarkable engineering works of the day. In calculating the strength of these different classes of girders, Mr. Stephenson observed, One ruling principle appertains, and is common to all of them. Primarily and essentially, the ultimate strength is considered to exist in the top and bottom, the former being exposed to a compression force by the action of the load, and the latter to a force of tension. Therefore, whatever be the class or denomination of girders, they must all be alike in amount of effective material in these members, if their spans and depths are the same, and they have to sustain the same amount of load. Hence, the question of comparative merit among the different classes of construction of beams or girders is really narrowed to the method of connecting the top and bottom webs, so called. In the tubular system, the connection is effected by continuous boiler plates riveted together, and in the lattice and trellis bridges by flat iron bars, more or less numerous, forming a series of struts and ties. Those engineers who advocate the employment of the latter form of construction set forth as its principal advantage the saving of material which is effected by employing bars instead of iron plates, whereas Mr. Stephenson and his followers urge that in point of economy the boiler plate side is equal to the bars, whilst in point of effective strength and rigidity it is decidedly superior. To show the comparative economy of material, he contrasted the lattice girder bridge over the River Trent on the Great Northern Railway near Newark with the tubes of the Victoria Bridge. In the former case, where the span is 240.5 feet and the bridge 13 feet wide, the weight, including bearings, is 292 tons. In the latter, where the span is 242 feet, the width of the tube 16 feet, the weight, including bearings, is 275 tons, showing a balance in favour of the Victoria tube of 17 tons. The comparison between the Newark Dyke Bridge and the tubular bridge over the River Aire is equally favourable to the latter, and no one can have travelled over the Great Northern Line to York without noting that as respects rigidity under the passing train, the tubular bridge is decidedly superior. It is ascertained that the deflection caused by a passing load is considerably greater in the former case, and Mr. Stephenson was also of the opinion that the sides of all trellis or lattice girders are useless, except for the purpose of connecting the top and bottom, and keeping them in their position. They depend upon their connection with the top and bottom webs for their own support, and since they could not sustain their shape, but would collapse immediately on their being disconnected from their top and bottom members, it is evident that they add to the strain upon them, and consequently to that extent reduce the ultimate strength of the beams. I admit, he added, that there is no formula for valuing the solid sides for strains, and that at present we only subscribe to them the value or use of connecting the top and bottom. Yet we are aware that from their continuity and solidity they are of value to resist horizontal and many other strains, independently of the top and bottom, by which they add very much to the stiffness of the beam, and the fact of their containing more material than is necessary to connect the top and bottom webs has by no means been fairly established. Another important advantage of the tubular bridge over the trellis or lattice structure consists in its greater safety in event of a train running off the line, a contingency which has more than once occurred on a tubular bridge without detriment, whereas in event of such an accident occurring on a trellis or lattice bridge, it must infallibly be destroyed. Where the proposed bridge is of the unusual length of 1.25 miles, it is obvious that this consideration must have no small weight with the directors, who eventually decided on proceeding with the tubular bridge, according to Mr. Stephenson's original design. From the first projection of the Victoria Bridge, the difficulties of executing such a work across a wide river, down which an avalanche of ice rushes to the sea every spring, were pronounced almost insurmountable by those best acquainted with the locality. The ice of 2,000 miles of inland lakes and upper rivers, besides their tributaries, is then poured downstream, and in the neighbourhood of Montreal especially, it is often piled up to the height of from 40 to 50 feet, placing the surrounding country under water and doing severe damage to the massive stone buildings along the noble riverfront of the city. To resist so prodigious a pressure, it was necessary that the piers of the proposed bridge should be of the most solid and massive description. Their foundations are placed in the solid rock, for none of the artificial methods of obtaining foundations, suggested by some engineers for cheapness' sake, were found practicable in this case. Where the force exercised against the piers was likely to be so great, it was felt that timber icebreakers, timber or cast iron piling, or even rubble work would have proved but temporary expedients. The two centre piers are 18 feet wide, and the remaining 22 piers 15 feet. To arrest and break the ice, an inclined plane, composed of great blocks of stone, was added to the upriver side of each pier, each block weighing from 7 to 10 tons, and the whole were firmly clamped together with iron rivets. To convey some idea of the immense force which these piers are required to resist, we may briefly describe the breaking up of the ice in March 1858, while the bridge was under construction. 14 out of the 24 piers were then finished, together with the formidable abutments and approaches to the bridge. The ice in the river began to show signs of weakness on the 29th of March, but it was not until the 31st that a general movement became observable, which continued for an hour, when it suddenly stopped, and the water rose rapidly. On the following day, at noon, a grand movement commenced. The waters rose about 4 feet in 2 minutes, up to a level with many of the Montreal streets. The fields of ice, at the same time, were suddenly elevated to an incredible height, and so overwhelming were they in appearance that crowds of the townspeople, who had assembled on the quay to watch the progress of the flood, ran for their lives. This movement lasted about 20 minutes, during which the jammed ice destroyed several portions of the quay wall, grinding the hardest blocks to atoms. The embanked approaches to the Victoria Bridge had tremendous forces to resist. In the full channel of the stream, the ice in its passage between the piers was broken up by the force of the blow immediately on its coming in contact with the cutwaters. Sometimes thick sheets of ice were seen to rise up and rear on end against the piers, but by force of the current they were speedily made to roll over into the stream, and in a moment after were out of sight. For the next 2 days the river was still high, until on the 4th of April the waters seemed suddenly to give way, and by the following day the river was flowing clear and smooth as a mill pond, nothing of winter remaining except the masses of bordage ice which were strewn along the shores of the stream. On examination of the piers of the bridge, it was found that they had admirably resisted the tremendous pressure, and though the timber crib work erected to facilitate the placing of floating pontoons to form the dams was found considerably disturbed, and in some places seriously damaged, the piers, with the exception of 1 or 2 heavy stone blocks, which were still unfinished, escaped uninjured. One heavy block of many tons weight was carried to a considerable distance, and must have been torn out of its place by sheer force, as several of the broken fragments were found left in the pier. The works in connection with the Victoria Bridge were begun on the 22nd of July 1854, when the first stone was laid, and continued uninterruptedly during a period of 5½ years, until the 17th of December 1859, when the bridge was finished and taken off the contractor's hands. It was formally opened for traffic early in 1860, though Robert Stephenson did not live to see its completion. The tubular system was also applied by the same engineer in a modified form in the 2 bridges across the Nile, near Damietta, in Lower Egypt. That near Benha contains 8 spans or openings of 80 feet each, and 2 centre spans, formed by one of the largest swing bridges ever constructed, the total length of the swing beam being 157 feet, a clear waterway of 60 feet being provided on either side of the centre pier. The only novelty in these bridges consisted in the road being carried upon the tubes instead of within them, their erection being carried out in the usual manner by means of workmen, materials, and plant sent out from England. During the latter years of his life, Mr. Stephenson took considerable interest in public affairs and in scientific investigations. In 1847 he entered the House of Commons as member for Whitby, but he does not seem to have been very devoted to his attendance, and only appeared on divisions when there was a whip of the party to which he belonged. He was a member of the Sanitary and Sewage Commissions, and of the commission which sat on Westminster Bridge. The last occasions on which he addressed the House were on the Suez Canal and the cleansing of the Serpentine. He pronounced the Suez Canal to be an impracticable scheme. "I have surveyed the line," said he. "I have travelled the whole distance on foot, and I declare there is no fall between the 2 seas. Honourable members talk about a canal. A canal is impossible. The thing would only be a ditch. Besides constructing the railway between Alexandria and Cairo, he was consulted, like his father, by the King of Belgium as to the railways of that country, and he was made a Knight of the Order of Leopold because of the improvements which he had made in locomotive engines, so much to the advantage of the Belgian system of inland transit. He was consulted by the King of Sweden as to the railway between Christiania and Lake Mjølsen, and in consideration of his services was decorated with the Grand Cross of the Order of St. Olaf. He also visited Switzerland, Piedmont and Denmark, to advise as to the system of railway communication best suited for those countries. At the Paris Exhibition of 1855, the Emperor of France decorated him with the Legion of Honour in consideration of his public services, and at home the University of Oxford made him a Doctor of Civil Laws. In 1855 he was elected President of the Institute of Civil Engineers, which office he held with honour and filled with distinguished ability for 2 years, giving place to his friend Mr. Locke at the end of 1857. Mr. Stephenson was frequently called upon to act as arbitrator between contractors and railway companies, or between one company and another, great value being attached to his opinion on account of his weighty judgment, his great experience, and his upright character, and we believe his decisions were invariably stamped by the qualities of impartiality and justice. He was always ready to lend a helping hand to a friend, and no petty jealousy stood between him and his rivals in the engineering world. The author remembers being with Mr. Stephenson one evening at his house in Gloucester Square, when a note was put into his hand from his friend Brunel, then engaged in his first fruitless efforts to launch the Great Eastern. It was to ask Stephenson to come down to Blackwall early next morning and give him the benefit of his judgment. Shortly after 6 next morning Stephenson was in Scott Russell's building yard, and he remained there until dusk. About midday, while superintending the launching operations, the baulk of timber on which he stood canted up, and he fell up to his middle in the Thames mud. He was dressed as usual, without greatcoat, though the day was bitter cold, and with only thin boots upon his feet. He was urged to leave the yard and change his dress, or at least dry himself, but with his usual disregard of health, he replied, "Oh, never mind me, I'm quite used to this sort of thing." And he went paddling about in the mud, smoking his cigar until almost dark, when the day's work was brought to an end. The result of this exposure was an attack of inflammation of the lungs, which kept him to his bed for a fortnight. He was habitually careless of his health, and perhaps he indulged in narcotics to a prejudicial extent. Hence he often became hipped and sometimes ill. When Mr. Sopwith accompanied him to Egypt in the Titania in 1856, he succeeded in persuading Mr. Stephenson to limit his indulgence in cigars and stimulants, and the consequence was that by the end of the voyage he felt himself, as he said, quite a new man. Arrived in Marseille, he telegraphed from thence a message to Great George Street, prescribing certain stringent and salutary rules for observance in the office there on his return. But he was of a facile social disposition, and the old associations proved too strong for him. When he sailed for Norway in the autumn of 1859, though then ailing in health, he looked a man who still had plenty of life in him. By the time he returned, his fatal illness had seized him. He was attacked by congestion of the liver, which first developed itself in jaundice and then ran into dropsy, of which he died on the 12th of October in the 56th year of his age. He was buried by the side of Telford in Westminster Abbey, amidst the departed great men of his country, and was attended to his resting place by many of the intimate friends of his boyhood and his manhood. Among those who assembled round his grave were some of the greatest men of thought and action in England, who embraced the sad occasion to pay the last mark of their respect to this illustrious son of one of England's greatest working men. It would be out of keeping with the subject thus drawn to a conclusion to pronounce any panegyric on the character and achievements of George and Robert Stephenson. These, for the most part, speak for themselves. Both were emphatically true men, exhibiting in their lives many sterling qualities. No beginning could have been less promising than that of the elder Stephenson. Born in a poor condition, yet rich in spirit, He was from the first compelled to rely upon himself, and every step of advance which he made was conquered by patient labour. Whether working as a brakesman or an engineer, his mind was always full of the work in hand. He gave himself thoroughly up to it. Like the painter, he might say that he had become great by neglecting nothing. Whatever he was engaged upon, he was as careful of the details as if each were itself the whole. He did all thoroughly and honestly. There was no scamping with him. When a workman, he put his brains and labour into his work, and when a master, he put his conscience and character into it. He would have no slop work executed merely for the sake of profit. The materials must be as genuine as the workmanship was skilful. The structures which he designed and executed were distinguished for their thoroughness and solidity. His locomotives were famous for their durability and excellent working qualities. The engines which he sent to the United States in 1832 are still in good condition, and even the engines built by him for the Killingworth colliery, upwards of 30 years ago, are working steadily there to this day. All his work was honest, representing the actual character of the man. He was ready to turn his hand to anything: shoes and clocks, railways and locomotives. He contrived his safety lamp with the object of saving pitmen's lives, and perilled his own life in testing it. Whatever work was nearest him, he turned to and did it. With him, to resolve was to do. Many men knew far more than he, but none were more ready forthwith to apply what he did know to practical purposes. It was while working at Willington as a brakesman that he first learned how best to handle a spade in throwing ballast out of the ship's holds. This casual employment seems to have left upon his mind the strongest impression of what hard work was, and he often used to revert to it, and say to the young men about him, "Ah, ye lads, there's none of you know what work is." Mr. Gooch says he was proud of the dexterity in handling a spade which he had thus acquired, and that he has frequently seen him take the shovel from a labourer in some railway cutting, and show him how to use it more deftly in filling waggons of earth, gravel, or sand. Sir Joshua Walmsley has also informed us that when examining the works of the Orleans and Tours Railway, Mr. Stephenson, seeing a large number of excavators filling and wheeling sand in a cutting at a great waste of time and labour, went up to the men and said he would show them how to fill their barrows in half the time. He showed them the proper position in which to stand, so as to exercise the greatest amount of power with the least expenditure of strength, and he filled the barrow with comparative ease again and again in their presence, to the great delight of the workmen. When passing through his own workshops, he would point out to his men how to save labour, and to get through their work skilfully and with ease. His energy imparted itself to others, quickening and influencing them as strong characters always do, flowing down into theirs and bringing out their best powers. His deportment towards the workmen employed under him was familiar, yet firm and consistent. As he respected their manhood, so did they respect his masterhood. Although he comported himself towards his men as if they occupied very much the same level as himself, he yet possessed that peculiar capacity for governing which enabled him always to preserve among them the strictest discipline, and to secure their cheerful and hearty services. Mr. Ingham, MP for South Shields, on going over to the workshops at Newcastle, was particularly struck with this quality of the master in his bearing towards his men. There was nothing, said he, of undue familiarity in their intercourse, but they spoke to each other as man to man, and nothing seemed to please the master more than to point out illustrations of the ingenuity of his artisans. He took up a rivet and expatiated on the skill with which it had been fashioned by the workman's hand, its perfectness and truth. He was always proud of his workmen and his pupils, and while indifferent and careless as to what might be said of himself, he fired up in a moment if disparagement was thrown upon any one whom he had taught or trained. In manner, George Stephenson was simple, modest, and unassuming, but always manly. He was frank and social in spirit. When a humble workman, he had carefully preserved his sense of self-respect. His companions looked up to him, and his example was worth even more to many of them than books or schools. His devoted love of knowledge made his poverty respectable, and adorned his humble calling. When he rose to a more elevated station, and associated with men of the highest position and influence in Britain, he took his place among them with perfect self-possession. They wondered at the quiet ease and simple dignity of his deportment, and men in the best ranks of life have said of him that he was one of nature's gentlemen. Probably no military chiefs were ever more beloved by their soldiers than were both father and son by the army of men who, under their guidance, worked at labours of profit, made labours of love by their earnest will and purpose. True leaders of men and lords of industry, they were always ready to recognise and encourage talent in those who worked for and with them. Thus it was pleasant at the openings of the Stephenson lines to hear the chief engineers attributing the successful completion of the works to their able assistants, while the assistants, on the other hand, ascribed the glory to their chiefs. Mr. Stephenson, though a thrifty and frugal man, was essentially unsordid. His rugged path in early life made him careful of his resources. He never saved to hoard, but saved for a purpose, such as the maintenance of his parents or the education of his son. In later years he became a prosperous and even a wealthy man, but riches never closed his heart nor stole away the elasticity of his soul. He enjoyed life cheerfully because hopefully. When he entered upon a commercial enterprise, whether for others or for himself, he looked carefully at the ways and means. Unless they would pay, he held back. He would have nothing to do, he declared, with stock-jobbing speculations. His refusal to sell his name to the schemes of the railway mania, his survey of the Spanish lines without remuneration, his offer to postpone his claim for payment from a poor company until their affairs became more prosperous, are instances of the unsordid spirit in which he acted. Another marked feature in Mr. Stephenson's character was his patience. Notwithstanding the strength of his convictions as to the great uses to which the locomotive might be applied, he waited long and patiently for the opportunity of bringing it into notice, and for years after he had completed an efficient engine, he went on quietly devoting himself to the ordinary work of the colliery. He made no noise nor stir about his locomotive, but allowed another to take credit for the experiments on velocity and friction made with it by himself upon the Killingworth Railroad. By patient industry and laborious contrivance, he was enabled, with the powerful help of his son, to do for the locomotive what James Watt had done for the condensing engine. He found it clumsy and inefficient, and he made it powerful, efficient, and useful. Both have been described as the improvers of their respective engines, but as to all that is admirable in their structure or vast in their utility, they are rather entitled to be described as their inventors. While the invention of Watt increased the power, and at the same time so regulated the action of the steam engine as to make it capable of being applied alike to the hardest work and to the finest manufactures, the intervention of Stephenson gave an effective power to the locomotive, which enabled it to perform the work of teams of the most powerful horses and to outstrip the speed of the fleetest. Watt's invention exercised a wonderfully quickening influence on every branch of industry, and multiplied 1,000-fold the amount of manufactured productions, and Stephenson's enabled these to be distributed with an economy and dispatch such as had never before been thought possible. They have both tended to increase indefinitely the mass of human comforts and enjoyments, and to render them cheap and accessible to all. But Stephenson's invention, by the influence which it is daily exercising upon the civilization of the world, is even more remarkable than that of Watt, and is calculated to have still more important consequences. In this respect, it is to be regarded as the grandest application of steam power that has yet been discovered. The locomotive, like the condensing engine, exhibits the realization of various capital but wholly distinct ideas promulgated by many ingenious inventors. Stephenson, like Watt, exhibited a power of selection, combination, and invention of his own, by which, while availing himself of all that had been done before him, and superadding the many skilful contrivances devised by himself, he was at length enabled to bring his engine into a condition of marvellous power and efficiency. He gathered together the scattered threads of ingenuity which already existed, and combined them into one firm and complete fabric of his own. He realized the plans which others had imperfectly formed, and was the first to construct what so many others had unsuccessfully attempted, the practical and economical working locomotive. Mr. Stephenson's close and accurate observation provided him with a fullness of information on many subjects, which often appeared surprising to those who had devoted to them a special study. On one occasion, the accuracy of his knowledge of birds came out in a curious way at a convivial meeting of railwaymen in London. The engineers and railway directors present knew each other as railwaymen and nothing more. The talk had been all of railways and railway politics. Mr. Stephenson was a great talker on those subjects, and was generally allowed, from the interest of his conversation and the extent of his experience, to take the lead. At length one of the party broke in with, "Come now, Stephenson, we have had nothing but railways. Cannot we have a change, and try if we can talk a little about something else?" "Well," said Mr. Stephenson, "I'll give you a wide range of subjects. What shall it be about?" "Say birds' nests," rejoined the other, who prided himself on his special knowledge of this subject. "Then birds' nests let it be." A long and animated conversation ensued. The bird nesting of his boyhood, the blackbird's nest which his father had held him up in his arms to look at when a child at Wilham, the hedges in which he had found the thrushes and the linnets' nests, the mossy bank where the robin built, the cleft in the branch of the young tree where the chaffinch had reared its dwelling, all rose up clear in his mind's eye, and led him back to the scenes of his boyhood at Callerton and Dewley Burn. The colour and number of the birds' eggs, the period of their incubation, the materials employed by them for the walls and lining of their nests, were described by him so vividly, and illustrated with such graphic anecdotes, that one of the party remarked that if George Stephenson had not been the greatest engineer of his day, he might have been one of the greatest naturalists. His powers of conversation were very great. He was so thoughtful, so original, and so suggestive, there was scarcely a department of science on which he had not formed some novel, and sometimes daring theory. Thus, Mr. Gooch, his pupil, who lived with him when at Liverpool, informs us that when sitting over the fire, he would frequently broach his favourite theory of the sun's light and heat being the original source of the light and heat given forth by the burning coal. "It fed the plants on which that coal is made," he would say, "and has been bottled up in the earth ever since, to be given out again now for the use of man." His son Robert once said of him, "My father flashed his bull's eye full upon a subject, and brought it out in its most vivid light in an instant. His strong common sense and his varied experience operating upon a thoughtful mind were his most powerful illuminators." Mr. Stephenson had once a conversation with a watchmaker, whom he astonished by the extent and minuteness of his knowledge as to the parts of a watch. The watchmaker knew him to be an eminent engineer, and asked him how he acquired so extensive a knowledge of a branch of business so much out of his sphere. "It is very easy to be explained," said Mr. Stephenson. "I worked long at watch cleaning myself, and when I was at a loss I was never ashamed to ask for information." Towards the close of his life he frequently went down to Newcastle and visited the scenes of his boyhood. "I have been to Callerton," he said one day to a friend, "and seen the fields in which I used to pull turnips at twopence a day, and many a cold finger I can tell you I had." His hand was open to his former fellow workmen, whom old age had left in poverty. To poor Robert Gray of Newburn, who acted as his bridesmaid on his marriage to Fanny Henderson, he left a pension for life. He would slip a £5 note into the hand of a poor man or a widow in such a way as not to offend their delicacy, but to make them feel as if the obligation were all on his side. When Farmer Patterson, who married a sister of George's first wife, Fanny Henderson, died and left a large young family fatherless, poverty stared them in the face. "But ye ken," said our informant, "George struck in father for them." And perhaps the providential character of the act could not have been more graphically expressed than in these simple words. On his visits to Newcastle, he would frequently meet the friends of his early days, occupying very nearly the same station, whilst he had, meanwhile, risen to almost world-wide fame. But he was no less hearty in his greeting of them than if their relative position had continued the same. Thus, one day, after shaking hands with Mr. Brandling on alighting from his carriage, he proceeded to shake hands with his coachman, Anthony Wigham, a still older friend, though he only sat on the box. Robert Stephenson inherited his father's kindly spirit and benevolent disposition. He almost worshipped his father's memory, and was ever ready to attribute to him the chief merit of his own achievements as an engineer. "It was through his thorough training," we once heard him say, "his example and his character which made me the man I am." On a more public occasion he said, "It is my great pride to remember that whatever may have been done, and however extensive may have been my own connection with railway development, all I know and all I have done is primarily due to the parent whose memory I cherish and revere." To Mr. Lough, the sculptor, he said that he never had but two loves, one for his father, the other for his wife. Like his father, he was eminently practical, and yet always open to the influence and guidance of correct theory. His main consideration in laying out his lines of railway was what would best answer the intended purpose, or, to use his own words, to secure the maximum of result with the minimum of means. He was pre-eminently a safe man, because cautious, tentative, and experimental, following closely the lines of conduct trodden by his father, and often quoting his maxims. In society, Robert Stephenson was simple, unobtrusive, and modest, but charming and even fascinating in an eminent degree. Sir John Lawrence has said of him that he was, of all others, the man he most delighted to meet in England. He was so manly, yet gentle, and withal so great. While admired and beloved by men of such calibre, he was equally a favourite with women and children. He put himself upon the level of all, and charmed them no less by his inexpressible kindliness of manner than by his simple yet impressive conversation. His great wealth enabled him to perform many generous acts in a right noble and yet modest manner, not letting his right hand know what his left hand did. Of the numerous kindly acts of his which have been made public, we may mention the graceful manner in which he repaid the obligations which both himself and his father owed to the Newcastle Literary and Philosophical Institute, when working together as humble experimenters in their cottage at Killingworth. The Institute was struggling under a debt of £6,200, which seriously impaired its usefulness as an educational agency. Robert Stephenson offered to pay one half of the sum, provided the local supporters of the Institute would raise the remainder, and conditional also on the annual subscription being reduced from 2 guineas to 1, in order that the usefulness of the institution might be extended. The generous offer was accepted, and the debt extinguished. Both father and son were offered knighthood, and both declined it. During the summer of 1847, George Stephenson was invited to offer himself as a candidate for the representation of South Shields in Parliament. But his politics were at best of a very indefined sort. Indeed, his life had been so much occupied with subjects of a practical character that he had scarcely troubled himself to form any decided opinion on the party political topics of the day, and to stand the crossfire of the electors on the hustings might have been found an even more distressing ordeal than the cross-questioning of the barristers in the committees of the House of Commons. "Politics," he used to say, "are all matters of theory. There's no stability in them. They shift about like the sands of the sea, and I should feel quite out of my element among them." He had accordingly the good sense respectfully to decline the honour of contesting the representation of South Shields. We have, however, been informed by Sir Joseph Paxton that although George Stephenson held no strong opinions on political questions generally, there was one question on which he entertained a decided conviction, and that was the question of free trade. The words used by him on one occasion to Sir Joseph were very strong. "England," said he, "is and must be a shopkeeper, and our docks and harbours are only so many wholesale shops, the doors of which should always be kept wide open." It is curious that his son Robert should have taken precisely the opposite view of this question, and acted throughout with the most rigid party among the protectionists, supporting the navigation laws and opposing free trade. But Robert Stephenson will be judged in after times by his achievements as an engineer, rather than by his acts as a politician, and happily these last were far outweighed in value by the immense practical services which he rendered to trade, commerce, and civilization through the facilities which the railways constructed by him afforded for free intercommunication between men in all parts of the world. Speaking in the midst of his friends at Newcastle in 1850, he observed, It seems to me but yesterday that I was engaged as an assistant in laying out the Stockton and Darlington Railway. Since then, the Liverpool and Manchester and 100 other great works have sprung into existence. As I look back upon these stupendous undertakings, accomplished in so short a time, it seems as though we had realised in our generation the fabled powers for the magician's wand. Hills have been cut down and valleys filled up, and when these simple expedients have not sufficed, high and magnificent viaducts have been raised. And if mountains stood in the way, tunnels of unexampled magnitude have pierced them through, bearing their triumphant attestation to the indomitable energy of the nation and the unrivalled skill of our artisans. As respects the immense advantages of railways to mankind, there cannot be two opinions. They exhibit, probably, the grandest organisation of capital and labour that the world has yet seen. Although they have unhappily occasioned great loss to many, the loss has been that of individuals, whilst, as a national system, the gain has already been enormous, as tending to multiply and spread abroad the conveniences of life, opening up new fields of industry, bringing nations nearer to each other, and thus promoting the great ends of civilization. The founding of the railway system by George Stephenson and his son must be regarded as one of the most important events, if not the very greatest, in the first half of this 19th century. End of The Lives of the Engineers, George and Robert Stephenson, by Samuel Smiles. Read by Andy Minter in Tring, Hertfordshire, June 2010.